Chapter 12, Heraclius and Mohem 641 by Charles Oman. Distress of the empire in the early years of Heraclius, the letter of Chosroes, treachery of the Avars. Heraclius preaches a crusade. His 6 victorious campaigns, great siege of Constantinople, Persia vanquished, triumph of Heraclius, rise and character of Mohammed, the creed of Islam, conquests of the caliphs in Syria and Persia, troubled old age of Heraclius. When the tyrant Phocas had been handed over to the executioner to pay the penalty for his innumerable misdeeds, the Senate and army joined in offering the crown to the young Heraclius, the saviour whose advent had delivered them from such a depth of misery. He was duly crowned by the patriarch and acclaimed by the people in the hippodrome. But when the first rejoicings were over, and he turned to contemplate the state of the empire which he had just won, the prospect was not a very reassuring one. The Slavs were spreading all over the Balkan peninsula, as far as the gates of Thessalonica and the pass of Thermopylae. The Persian, securely established in northern Syria and Mesopotamia, was advancing to permanently reduce the lands of Asia Minor, which he had ravaged so fiercely in the 2 preceding years. The treasury was empty, and the army scattered and disorganized. For some years it had not dared to meet the Persian in the open field, and the officers whom Phocas had kept in command had never won its confidence. The first 10 years of the reign of Heraclius seemed little better than a continuation of the miseries of the time of Phocas. The empire had gained, indeed, a good man instead of a bad as its ruler, but a change of fortune had not come with the change of sovereigns. It seemed that Heraclius would not be able to cope with the legacy of accumulated ills that had been left him. His predecessor's dying taunt, "Will you rule the empire any better than I have done?" must often have rung in his ears when the never-ending tidings of battles lost, towns stormed, revenues decreasing and starving provinces kept coming into him. The imperial etiquette which had prevailed for the last 200 years prescribed that the Augustus should never take the field in person, and this rule seems to have prevented Heraclius from heading his own armies. The generals to whom he delegated his power were uniformly unfortunate and occasionally disloyal. He was obliged to depose Priscus, the officer who had betrayed Phocas, for arrogant disobedience to his orders. The absence of the emperor from the field was a grave misfortune, for he was much less of an administrator than of a fighting man. His form and face betrayed the warrior. He was of middle stature, strongly built and broad-chested, with a fair complexion, grey eyes and yellow hair. He wore a bushy beard till he ascended the throne, when he shaved it, and did not let it grow again till he went to the wars 10 years later. Persian successes, 613–17. The military disasters of the first 8 years of Heraclius' reign were terrible. In 613, the armies of Chosroes began to attack central Syria, Damascus fell, and then the general Shahbaz pushed southward into Palestine. In 614, the whole Christian world was seized with horror at learning that Jerusalem had been captured. Not only were 90,000 Christians slain in the Holy City, but, what was reckoned far worse, all the treasures of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre fell into the hands of the fire worshippers. Chief of them was the sacred wood, the true cross, which the Empress Helena, the mother of the great Constantine, had discovered in 327 and placed in her magnificent church. It was now carried into Persia, to be marked by the blasphemous King Chosroes. This was not the end of the disasters of the empire. In 616, Shahbaz forced his way across the sands of the Isthmus of Suez and attacked Egypt, the one Roman province which had not seen the horrors of war for 3 centuries. The unwarlike Egyptians submitted with hardly a blow. Many of the heretical sects that swarmed in the Nile Valley even welcomed the Persians as friends and deliverers. The loss of Egypt seemed a death blow to the empire. It had been of late the chief source of revenue to the dwindling treasury of Heraclius, and on its corn the multitude of Constantinople had been wont to depend for their free dole of bread. This had now to be cut off, for the state finances did not permit of the provision being purchased elsewhere. In 617, the invasion of Asia Minor was resumed, and a Persian force seized Chalcedon, in very sight of the walls of Constantinople. The darkest hour had arrived. It is a great testimonial to the popularity of Heraclius that the series of misfortunes which we have related did not cost him his throne. Any sovereign less well-intentioned and less esteemed would have lost life and crown. The letter of Chosroes. The direst moment of his humiliation arrived when, after the loss of Egypt, the overweening Chosroes sent him a formal letter, inviting him to lay down the scepter which he could not wield. In language of arrogant condescension, which almost seems to have been borrowed from the letter of King Sennacherib in the Book of Kings. The Persian wrote, Chosroes, greatest of gods and master of the whole earth, to Heraclius, his vile and insensate slave, why do you still refuse to submit to our rule and call yourself a king? Have I not destroyed the Greeks? You say that you trust in your God. Why has he not delivered out of my hand Caesarea, Jerusalem, and Alexandria? And shall I not also destroy Constantinople? But I will pardon your faults if you will submit to me, and come hither with your wife and children. And I will give you lands, vineyards, and olive groves, and look upon you with a kindly aspect. Do not deceive yourself with vain hope in that Christ, who was not able even to save himself from the Jews, who killed him by nailing him to a cross. Even if you take refuge in the depths of the seas, I shall stretch out my hand and take you, so that you shall see me, whether you will or no. For a moment it is said that Heraclius contemplated abandoning Constantinople and taking refuge in his father's old stronghold of Carthage, but the very desperateness of the state of affairs brought its own remedy. Crusade of Heraclius, incensed at the arrogance of Chosroes, smarting under the loss of the Holy Cross, and pinched for every necessary of life, the East Romans were ready to strike one wild blow for existence. The Church took the lead, and declared the war to be a holy duty for all Christian men, the first of the Crusades. The Patriarch Sergius bound the emperor by an oath not to abandon his people, and the clergy offered as a war loan all the gold and silver plate of the churches of Constantinople. Heraclius took heart, and, casting aside the trammels of imperial etiquette, swore that he would himself lead his army in the field. Thousands of volunteers were collected, and the treasures of the church lavished on their equipment. By the end of 618, this effort of despair had given the empire once more a general, an army, and a military chest. But an attack on the Persian host in Asia Minor did not turn out to be at once feasible. A sudden danger at home obliged Heraclius to delay his crusade. The Avars concentrated their ravages on Thrace, and their hordes rode up almost to the gates of Constantinople. It was necessary at all costs to free the city from the danger of attack in the rear before the army crossed over into Asia. Treachery of the Avars. Accordingly, the emperor sent to offer a subsidy to the Chagan of the Avars if he would withdraw beyond the Danube. The Chagan proposed a conference at Heraclea, 40 miles west of Constantinople, the point to which he had advanced his army. Heraclius consented to the meeting, and rode out in royal state with all his court. But the faithless Avar was meditating treachery. He concealed troops of his horsemen in the hills, with the object of waylaying Heraclius on his way to Heraclea, and of holding him to ransom. The emperor was warned just in time to escape from the ambush. Throwing off his long purple robe and tucking his diadem under his arm, he rode hard for Constantinople, with the Avars close at his heels. Many of his court and thousands of the Thracian peasantry, who had turned out to witness the meeting, fell into the hands of the enemy. Heraclius had just time to order the gates to be closed before the pursuers swept through the suburbs and up to the walls. In spite of this piece of abominable treachery, the emperor was still fain to conclude a peace with the Avars, as an absolutely necessary preliminary before attacking the Persian. In 620, a peace of some sort was patched up, in return for a payment of money, but even then Heraclius was not able to start on his projected campaign. Some desultory Persian attacks on Constantinople, and notably an attempt to build a fleet at Chalcedon and cross the strait, had first to be frustrated. It was not that the emperor was finally enabled to take the offensive, but all preparations being complete, after solemnly keeping the Lenten fast, and receiving the benediction of the church for himself and his army, he set sail for Asia on Easter Day. He left his young son, Heraclius Constantinus, regent in his stead, under the charge of the Patriarch Sergius and the patrician Bonus, the commander of the garrison of Constantinople. In the 6 campaigns which followed, Heraclius displayed an energy and an ability which no one, judging from his quiescence during the last 10 years, would have expected him to possess. Historians only doubt whether to praise the more his strategical talents or his personal bravery. From the very first, he showed his ascendancy over the enemy, taking the offensive and turning the course of the war wherever he chose to direct it. At his first departure from Constantinople, he did not attack the Persian in the front, but boldly sailed round the southern capes of Asia Minor, and landed his army in Cilicia, on the Gulf of Issus, a position from which he threatened both Asia Minor and northern Syria. Marching up into Cappadocia, he cut the communications between the Persian army in Asia Minor and the Euphrates Valley. This movement had the result that he expected. Hastily evacuating Bithynia and Galatia, the Persian general Shahbaz drew back eastward, in order to regain touch with his country. Ere a blow was struck, Heraclius had cleared Western Asia Minor of the enemy, but he finished the campaign by inflicting a crushing defeat on Shahbaz in Cappadocia, and thus recovered Eastern Asia Minor also, 622. After in vain offering terms of peace to Chosroes, Heraclius took effective means in the next year to bring the Persian to reason. Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia were still in the hands of the enemy. He resolved to deliver them in the same manner that he had saved Asia Minor, by striking so hard at the enemy's base of operations that he should be compelled to call in all his outlying troops in order to defend Persia proper. Victorious campaigns of Heraclius, 622-27. In 623 Heraclius, abandoning his communication with the sea, plunged boldly inland, and fell on Media. For 2 whole years, he is lost to sight in the regions of the extreme east, subduing lands where no Roman army had ever been seen before, where indeed no European conqueror had ever penetrated since Alexander the Great. We hear of his winning 3 pitched battles, and of his storming 2 great Median towns, Ganzaka and the Barms, the latter the reputed birthplace of Zoroaster, the prophet of the Persians. It was some satisfaction to the army to destroy their magnificent temples in revenge for the sack of Jerusalem. To defend Media, Chosroes had to draw back his outlying armies from the west, and so far the purpose of Heraclius was served. But the emperor was still too weak to attack Persia proper or besiege Chosroes, capital of Ctesiphon. After wintering at Van, in the Armenian highlands, Heraclius dropped southward, in 625, and came into regions more within the ken of Western historians. He recovered the long-lost fortresses of Amida and Martyropolis, the ancient bulwarks of the empire on the upper Tigris, which had been for nearly 20 years in Persian hands, and once more picked up his communication with Constantinople, which had almost lost sight of him during the 2 last campaigns. The year ended with a 4th crushing defeat of Shahbaz, who had endeavored to throw himself between the emperor and his homeward path by defending the passage of the Sarus, near Germanisha. But 626 was destined to be the decisive year of the war. Before acknowledging himself beaten, the obstinate Chosroes was determined to make one final effort. Drawing every man that he could together, for the Persian Empire was now growing exhausted, the old king made 2 armies of them. While the larger was left in Mesopotamia and Armenia to endeavor to keep Heraclius employed, a great body under Shahbaz slipped southward, round the emperor's flank and marched for the Bosphorus. Great Siege of Constantinople, 626. Chosroes had concerted measures with the treacherous Chagan of the Avars for a combined attack on Constantinople, from both the European and the Asiatic side of the strait. When Shahbaz appeared at Chalcedon, he found the Avars already masters of Thrace, and preparing to beleaguer Byzantium. The 2 armies could see each other across the water, but they were wholly unable to communicate with each other, for the Roman fleet kept such excellent guard in the straits that no boat could cross. The patrician bonus made a most gallant defence, the garrison was adequate, and the population kept a good heart, for they knew that the Persian was striking his last desperate blow. Heraclius himself was so well satisfied with the impregnability of his capital that he only sent a few veteran troops by sea to co-operate in the defence, and kept the greater part of his army in hand for an attack on the heart of the dominions of Chosroes. Meanwhile, the host of Shahbaz had to look on in helpless impotence, while the Avars on the other side of the Bosphorus made their attempt on Constantinople. On the night of the 3rd of August 626, the Chagan gave the signal for the assault. A body of Slavs in small boats attempted to storm the seawall from the side of the Golden Horn, while the main body of the Avars moved against the land wall, but the galleys of Bonus rammed and sunk the light vessels of the Slavs, and the assault of the Avars miscarried entirely. Thereupon the Chagan hastily broke up his camp and retired beyond the Balkans. The siege was practically razed, though the army of Shahbaz still remained encamped at Chalcedon. Thus ended the first of the 4 great sieges of Constantinople, of which we have to tell. Meanwhile, Heraclius had been retaliating on Persia in the most effective way. In return for the invasion of Thrace by the Avars, he called in from beyond the Caucasus the wild Hunnish tribe of the Khazars, and turned them loose on Media and Assyria. 40,000 of their horsemen laid waste the whole land, as far as the gates of Ctesiphon, and the emperor took possession of the upper valley of the Tigris, and prepared to strike at his rival's capital in the coming year. Battle of Nineveh, 627. The campaign of 627 ended the triumphs of Heraclius. The last army of Persia under a general named Rhazates faced him near Nineveh. Charging at the head of the mailed horsemen of his guard, Heraclius slew the Persian chief with his own hand and scattered his forces to the winds. The victorious army pressed on and captured Dastagerd, the magnificent country palace of Chosroes near Ctesiphon, where they gained such plunder as no Roman army had won for many ages. They burnt Dastagerd and 4 palaces more, while Chosroes fled eastward to conceal himself in the mountains of Susiana. The long-suffering Persians were at last growing tired of their arrogant lord. Peace with Persia, 628. His army rebelled against him and proclaimed his son Cyrus as king. Chosroes himself was thrown into a dungeon, where he perished of cold and starvation. The new king at once sent to ask for terms of peace from Heraclius. The emperor, knowing the exhaustion of his own realm and its need for instant repose, made no hard conditions. Cyrus restored all the Roman territory still in his hands, released all Roman captives, paid a war indemnity, and, greatest of all triumphs in the eyes of the subjects of Heraclius, gave back the true cross and other spoils of Jerusalem. In May 628, the emperor was able to return to Constantinople, bringing peace and plenty with him. He had restored the boundary of the empire and inflicted on Persia a blow from which she never recovered. His arms had penetrated far beyond the limits of the conquests of Trajan and Severus, and his 6 years of unbroken victory were a record which no Roman, save Julius Caesar, could rival. Not unjustly did the inhabitants of Constantinople receive him with chants and sacred processions, and hail him by the name of the new Scipio. The crowning moment of his triumph came when the true cross was uplifted in St. Sophia, and publicly exposed for the adoration of the faithful. Well might the emperor have sung his Nunc Dimittis on that day of solemn rejoicing, and prayed that the hour of his triumph might be the last of his life. But already there was another tempest gathering, which was destined to sweep over the Roman Empire, with even greater violence than the Persian storm which had just been weathered. While in the midst of his last campaign, Heraclius had received a letter from an obscure Arabian prophet, bidding him accept a new revelation from heaven, which its framer called Islam, or submission to God. A similar missive was delivered at the same moment to Chosroes, then on the eve of his fall. Chosroes tore up the letter and swore he would at his leisure lay the insolent prophet in a dungeon. Heraclius sent a polite letter of acknowledgement and a trifling present to the unknown fanatic, being averse to making enemies of any sort while the Persian war was still on his hands. Little as it could have been foreseen at the time, the followers of the writer of these eccentric missives were fated to tear up the empire of Chosroes by the roots, and to lop off half of its fairest provinces from the realm of Heraclius. The Arabian prophet was no less a person than Mohammed the son of Abdallah, that strange being, half seer and half impostor, whose preaching was destined to convulse 3 continents and turn the stream of history into new and unexpected channels. Mohammed, the tribes of Arabia had hitherto been of very little importance. Their local feuds absorbed all their superfluous energy. They were divided from each other, as well by religious differences as by ancient clan hatreds. Some worshipped stocks and stones, some the host of heaven, some had partly adopted Christianity, others Judaism. They were given over to fetish worship, human sacrifices, drunkenness, infanticide, bloodshedding, polygamy, and highway robbery. Among these godless tribes appeared Mohammed, a poor man but born of an ancient and powerful clan, who preached to them a rigid Unitarian creed, accompanied by a reformation in morality. He had been called by the one true God, he said in a vision on Mount Hira, to proclaim a new revelation to his countrymen, to turn them from idolatry and hatred of each other to the worship of Allah and the practice of brotherly love. Mohammed was a being of a poetic and visionary temperament, given to high ideals and high enterprises. He was afflicted with long fits or trances, in which his soul wandered far into the fields of thought. These trances he took for divine inspirations, and his imaginings, which were often noble enough, seemed to him the direct commands of God, though in them good and grand ideas were freely mixed with baser elements, tainted by the ignorance, cruelty, and lust of a 7th-century Arab. For long the preaching of Mohammed was of no effect. His own tribe grew weary of his unending exhortations and chased him away from Mecca 622. The Hira 622. It is from this flight to Medina, the famous Hira, that all Moslem chronology is dated, but in spite of ill success and persecution the Prophet never swerved from his mission, and at last proselytes began flocking into him, and he became the head of a powerful sect. Then came the fatal moment which turned his teaching from a blessing to Arabia into a curse for the world. When he grew powerful enough, he bade his sectaries to take up the sword, and impose Islam on their neighbors by the force of arms. His first success in the field, the Battle of Badr, 624, was an encouragement to persevere in this evil path, and for the last 8 years of his life he went forth, conquering and to conquer among the tribes of Arabia, till he had built up a little theocratic empire in the peninsula, 624–32. Mohammed and his religion. Mohammed's successes were won by unhallowed means, and the desire to extend them at almost any cost gradually led him into compromises with the habits and superstitions of his countrymen, which were fatal to the purity of his religion. A strain of cunning, of revenge, of self-indulgence, appeared in a character which in his years of poverty and trouble had been blameless. He connived at the ancient fetish worship of the Arabs, by conceding that the conical black stone of the Kaaba, which they had always worshipped, had been hallowed by Abraham and should be the central shrine of his new faith. He fostered their vanity by proclaiming them the chosen people of God. He pandered to their craving for lust and bloodshed, by promising them the goods of their enemies to plunder in this life, and a heaven of gross sensual enjoyment in the next. He restricted, but he did not abolish, the evils of polygamy and slavery. In his day of triumph, he consigned whole tribes and towns to death, sometimes under circumstances of treachery as well as of cruelty. Worst of all, he foisted into his revelation special mandates of God, permitting himself to do things which his teaching forbade to his followers, such as to exceed his own limit of polygamy, and even to take his own foster son's bride to wife. It is hard to believe that he can have failed to see the horrible blasphemy involved in forging the name of God to special warrants approving his own lust. But this sin he repeatedly committed. The personal failings of Mohammed seem to have brought into his creed a blight of cruelty, bigotry and self-indulgence, which has rendered half useless its higher and nobler features. The religion which legalizes the slaughter and plunder of all unbelievers and consigns woman to the harem may have been a comparative blessing to the wild Arabs of Mohammed's own day, or to the Negro of the modern Soudan. To the civilized world it was a mere curse, the substitution of an inferior for a higher creed and life. Even to the Arab of the 7th century it was but half beneficial. If it stayed him from drunkenness, human sacrifices and infanticide, it merely directed his bloodthirstiness against foreign instead of domestic foes, and gave a divine sanction to many of his lower instincts. Failings of Islam. Wherever Mohammedanism has taken root, it has led at first to rapid and enthusiastic outbursts of vigor, but it seems gradually to sap the energy of the nations which adopt it, and leads, after a few generations of greatness, to a stagnation and decay, which the Moslem in his self-satisfied bigotry is too blind to perceive. The creed only thrives while militant. When it has won its victory, it sinks into dull apathy. Islam is a good religion to die by, as its fanatics have shown on 1,000 battlefields, but not a good religion to live by. Good and evil elements are too hopelessly mixed in it, just as in Mohammed's Quran, that miscellaneous receptacle of all his revelations. High thoughts about the Godhead or the fate of man are mingled with the mere opportunist orders of the day, or with licenses for the personal gratification of the Prophet.